Hi everyone, and welcome back to Adam's Scary Stories. Before we begin, I have to ask, if you appreciate these journeys into the dark, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button and share this episode with someone who enjoys being afraid. Good. Now, find a quiet room, turn off the lights, put in your earbuds and let the rest of the world fall away. Because tonight we aren't just telling a story. We're traveling to a place of profound isolation and ancient fear. Tonight we journey deep into the Alaskan wilderness. It was October 2019. The crisp autumn air was already biting deep into the Alaskan wilderness. My name is Liam, an independent documentary filmmaker, and I was with my small crew working on what I believed could be the project of a lifetime. Our mission was to uncover the secret of a place known only in whispers as the Valley of Silence. This valley was tucked away deep in the Alaskan interior. The site where in the 1980s 8 miners from the long-defunct Northern Lights Mining Co. had vanished without a trace. The official reports chalked it up to a freak blizzard and the case was closed. But the hushed stories shared among local indigenous communities and old-time hunters told a different tale, a story no one dared to speak aloud. They said the valley was cursed by a silence that swallows people whole. My crew was small and specialized. There was Maya, our sound engineer, a genius who could capture the faintest whisper of a breeze. Then there was Sam, our cameraman, a daredevil known for getting the perfect shot in the most treacherous conditions. And finally, there was Alex, our guide and survival expert, a man who had spent more of his life in the Alaskan backcountry than out of it. Our journey began with a small bush plane flight out of Anchorage. After hours of flying over an endless expanse of green and white, the pilot dropped us on the shore of a desolate, unnamed lake. From here, it was all on foot. Alex unfolded his map, his breath misting in the cold air. "The valley is about a 2-day hike from here," he said, his voice steady. "The terrain's rough, but the weather's on our side for now." The first day of the trek was grueling but normal. We were enveloped by the symphony of the wild, the rustle of the wind through the pines, the distant calls of birds, the satisfying crunch of dry leaves under our boots. Maya was in her element, her high-tech gear recording every nuance. "A forest has its own language, Liam," she'd said. "You just have to listen." I had no idea how terrifyingly true that statement would become. It was on the afternoon of the second day, as we neared the valley's entrance, that I noticed the first anomaly. The sounds of the forest began to fade. The birds went quiet. The wind died down. Even the sound of our own footsteps seemed muffled, lifeless. "Maya, are you getting this?" I asked, my voice low. She pulled off her headphones, a frown creasing her forehead. "Yeah. The frequency meter is almost flat. It's like we're walking into a soundproof room. This is unnatural." Sam, ever the pragmatist, panned his camera across the landscape. "Maybe it's the geography," he suggested. "The valley's walls could be blocking the sound." His explanation made sense, but a knot of unease was tightening in my stomach. The moment we stepped into the valley proper, that feeling intensified 1,000-fold. This wasn't just quiet, it was an absence of sound. A vacuum. A strange pressure built in our ears as if they were struggling to process the void. We had to almost shout to be heard, yet our voices came out sounding thin and hollow, swallowed by the oppressive stillness. Even Alex, a man I'd never seen rattled, had a look of deep unease. "I've spent my whole life in these woods," he whispered, "and I've never felt anything like this." We set up our base camp in the center of the valley near the skeletal remains of the old mining operation. A dilapidated log cabin, a few rusted tools, and a broken-down ore cart were the only tombstones for the men who had disappeared here. The place felt frozen in time. That first night was torment. The silence was so profound I could hear the thumping of my own heart and the rush of blood in my ears. These weren't comforting, life-affirming sounds. They were jarring and sinister, a reminder of how fragile the human machine is. I tried to sleep, but a profound sense of dread jolted me awake every time I drifted off. The next morning, everyone looked exhausted and pale. Maya was the most disturbed. She showed me her equipment, her face grim. The only thing she had recorded all night was a single, ultra-low frequency hum, almost below the threshold of human hearing. "This isn't natural, Liam," she insisted. "It's rhythmic, almost like something is on breathing." A chill went down my spine. We decided to investigate the mine entrance, hoping to find some clue, any clue. The entrance was a dark, gaping maw in the mountainside, a rotting wooden sign hanging precariously above it. The words "Northern Lights Mining" were barely legible. As we approached the mine, the silence became even more intense, physically painful. The pressure in our ears was immense. Sam switched on his camera's light and we stepped inside. The damp walls of the mine glistened in our flashlight beams. The air was heavy, suffocating. About 100 yards in, we found it. An old leather-bound journal, likely belonging to the mine foreman. The pages were warped with moisture, but some of the entries were still readable. October 15th, 1982. 5th day. The quiet is getting worse. The men are on edge. They talk of strange dreams. I tell them it's just exhaustion, but I feel it too. A fear I can't name. October 18th, 1982. George is gone. Vanished this morning. We've searched everywhere. No tracks. His tools are right where he left them. It's like he just dissolved into the air. The silence is unbearable now. It's getting inside our heads. The final entry sent a wave of pure dread through us. October 20th, 1982. It doesn't take the sound, it gives a sound, one you can only hear in your mind. It's calling to us. We're going now. It will give us peace. The sound of silence. The journal slipped from my fingers. It's calling to us? What did that mean? At that exact moment, Maya screamed, clutching her head, her eyes wide with agony. "It's in my head!" The sound. We rushed to her side. "What sound, Maya?" I yelled, my voice cracking. It's not saying anything. It just is," she sobbed. Suddenly, Sam, who was standing a few feet behind us, went rigid. His eyes were fixed, staring into the deep blackness of the mine as if he'd heard his name called. "Sam, you okay, man?" Alex shook his shoulder, but he was completely unresponsive. And then it happened. Sam began to walk, slowly and deliberately, into the darkness. There was no hesitation. He moved with a calm, eerie purpose. "Sam, stop!" I screamed, running after him. But he was swallowed by the blackness in seconds. We called his name until our throats were raw. There was no reply. Only that crushing, absolute silence. Alex grabbed me, his voice filled with a terror I had never heard before. "Liam, we have to get out of here, now!" We half dragged, half carried the distraught Maya and fled back towards the camp. The sun was setting as we stumbled out of the mine, painting the valley in shades of orange and deep purple, making it look more menacing than ever. We packed our gear in a frantic rush, our only thought to escape the valley's invisible walls. The second we crossed the threshold out of the valley, the world came rushing back. The sound of the wind, the rustle of leaves, it was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. We didn't look back. We just ran until our lungs burned and our legs gave out. 3 of us had walked into that valley. Only 2 of us walked out. Sam was never seen again. When we finally made it back to civilization, we told the authorities everything. A search and rescue team was dispatched. They found nothing. No trace of Sam, no sign of his camera. He had vanished, just like the 8 miners before him. It's been years since that day. I never finished the documentary. The footage sits on a hard drive in my desk, a drive I've never had the courage to open. Maya quit sound engineering. She says that sometimes in the dead of night she can still hear that sound of silence echoing in her mind. I often lie awake wondering what that thing in the valley is. A natural phenomenon? A supernatural force? The foreman's last words are burned into my memory. It doesn't take the sound, it gives a sound. Maybe the silence is a living thing, a predator that uses a silent psychic call to lure its prey. Maybe Sam and those miners aren't dead. Maybe they just became part of the silence. I don't have the answers. But I know one thing for sure. Some places are meant to be left alone. And if you ever find yourself in the Alaskan wilderness and the world around you suddenly goes quiet, run. Just run and don't ever look back. Because the silence might be calling for you too. It was the fall of 2012. My brother Alan was a gifted and relentlessly passionate nature photographer. He had a fixation on desolate, forgotten places, believing that every piece of rusted metal and every splintered beam of wood held a century's worth of untold stories. It was this obsession that drew him to the Yukon region of Alaska, specifically to the abandoned Iron Creek mines which had been deserted since the gold rush fizzled out in the 1930s. He set off in early October, promising me he'd be back in 2 weeks with images that would stun the world. He was electric with excitement. The last message I ever got from him came via his satellite messenger. Made it to the trailhead. The place is unbelievably beautiful and eerie. Heading toward the mines tomorrow. After that, silence. When 2 weeks turned into 3, we reported him missing. A massive search was launched. Helicopters combed the area and search and rescue teams scoured the wilderness. They found Alan's rental truck parked at the start of an old, overgrown access road. Some of his gear was inside, but his camera bag, his most prized possession, was gone. The search lasted for weeks, but they found no trace of Alan. No tracks, no signs of a struggle, nothing. It was as if the wilderness had simply swallowed him. Finally, with the first heavy snows of winter, the official search was called off. Alan was declared missing, presumed deceased. For my family, it was a wound that wouldn't close. We tried to hold on to hope, but as the years passed, that hope was replaced by a hollow, aching grief. I tried to archive Alan's work, organizing his old photos, but his empty room and the thought of his missing camera were a constant, painful reminder of the unanswered questions. 5 years is a long time. Wounds don't heal, but you learn to build your life around the scars. I had moved on, or at least I'd told myself I had. But the memory of Alan was a ghost that never left. Then one afternoon, I got a call from the Alaska State Troopers. "Mr. Ryan?" The voice on the other end was serious, professional. "My name is Sergeant Miller. We're calling in reference to your brother, Alan Ryan." My heart hammered against my ribs. Did you find him?" "No, sir, but we've recovered some of his belongings." 2 backcountry hikers exploring an unmarked trail in the Iron Creek area had found a weathered, beaten-up camera bag wedged under a rock ledge. The bag itself was decaying, but inside, Alan's old Nikon D800 was remarkably well preserved. Tucked alongside it were a few personal effects and a small waterproof notebook. The troopers shipped the items to me. When I opened the box, it felt like I had been thrown back in time. There was the camera I'd seen in Alan's hands 1,000 times. My fingers trembled as I ejected the memory card. Were there answers on this tiny piece of plastic? A clue to what happened to my brother? I slid the card into my laptop, The folder contained dozens of images. The first were breathtaking shots of the Alaskan autumn Alan had described, vibrant golden aspens, serene lakes, and majestic mountain vistas. Each photo was a testament to his skill. Then the photos of the mines began. Rusted machinery, collapsing structures, and the dark, foreboding entrances to the mine shafts. Alan had captured the decay with an artist's eye. But as I clicked through the images, the mood shifted. The photos became darker, more claustrophobic. It felt like he was searching for something, or maybe hiding from something. One photo showed a close-up of strange, deep scratches on the rock wall inside a mine. They didn't look natural. They looked deliberate. The next few images were blurry, as if the camera had been jostled. And then I got to the last few files. IMG 078.jpg. Taken inside a mine. The flashlight beam illuminated a narrow tunnel stretching into oppressive darkness. Imgur Nutter 079.jpg. The same tunnel, but this time at the far end of the light's reach were two small, faint points of light. They looked like the eyeshine of an animal, but there was something unnatural about their intensity. EMG Loredo JPG. This one was a frantic, blurry shot, clearly taken while moving. The two glowing points were closer now. My heart was pounding in my throat. I knew the next one was the last. I took a deep, shuddering breath and clicked. Majority 1.jpg, the final photograph. It was a selfie. It was Alan's face. His eyes were wide with a terror so absolute it felt like it could tear through the screen. His mouth was open in a silent scream. Sweat and grime streaked his face. This wasn't the Alan I knew. This was a man who had seen hell. But the most horrifying part of the photo was what was behind him. Reaching over his shoulder from the pitch-black background was a long, pale hand. The fingers were thin and elongated like a spider's legs and tipped with filthy, jagged nails. The hand was gripping his shoulder, digging in, pulling him back into the darkness. Behind the hand, a vague shape was discernible in the gloom. A tall, stooped figure and the same two glowing eyes now staring directly, malevolently into the camera. I slammed my laptop shut with a cry. I was shaking uncontrollably. What was that thing? I fumbled for Alan's notebook, praying for an explanation. The last few pages were filled with a frantic, messy scrawl. Day 3, something is in the mine. I saw markings on the walls. They're not old. Someone or something lives here. Day 4. I saw it today, just a glimpse in the dark. Tall and thin, it was watching me. I have to get out. The final entry made my blood run cold. It won't let me leave. It knows the tunnels. It's everywhere. I heard it. It mimics my voice. It's calling my name. I'm trapped. If anyone finds this, don't come in. Don't take its picture. It hates the light, but it's drawn to it. The entry ended there, a jagged line trailing off the page. I took the camera and the notebook to the police. I showed them the final photograph. Sergeant Miller stared at it for a long time, a deeply troubled look on his face. He called in his colleagues. They debated it for hours. A digital forensics expert suggested it could be a combination of camera shake and pareidolia, the human tendency to see patterns like faces in random stimuli. Another argued it was probably a blurry shot of a bear or another predator. A few even floated the theory that Alan, an artist, had staged it. But no one could explain the raw, undiluted terror on my brother's face. The troopers sent a small, specialized team back to Iron Creek. They located the mine from Alan's photos. They found the scratches on the wall. But that was it. No creature, no bones, no other trace of Alan. The place was empty, silent. In the end, the case was closed again. Officially, Alan had gotten lost in the mountains and succumbed to the elements. The final photograph was filed away as inconclusive. But I know what I saw. I saw the fear in my brother's eyes. I saw the hand that was pulling him away. That photograph is now on an encrypted hard drive, locked in a safe. I look at it sometimes to remind myself of what really happened out there. I haven't shown it to anyone else. Some things aren't meant for the world to see. People ask me if I think there was a monster in that mine. I don't know what to call it, but I know the Alaskan wilderness is vast and ancient. There are things hidden in its shadows that are far beyond our understanding. Alan wanted to capture one of those secrets on film, but in the end, the secret captured him. And his final photograph is his only testament, a testament that will forever remain an unanswered, terrifying question. My name is Sam. I've lived my whole life in Alaska. I've seen this land in all its glory. The midnight sun of summer, the deep 6-month twilight of winter, and the impossible fiery colors of fall. I'm a hunter. It's not just a hobby, it's in my blood. My father was a hunter and his father before him. We learned to respect the wilderness, but we were never afraid of it. At least, I wasn't. Not before that day. It was November 2018, winter was closing in and the hunting season was in full swing. I was deep in the Talkeetnas tracking a bull moose. The area is known for its dense forests and old abandoned mines, relics from a gold rush that had died out a century ago. I'd been out alone for days using a small rustic cabin as my base camp, heading out each morning with a renewed sense of purpose. One morning, just as the sky was beginning to blush with the dawn, I found him. A massive, magnificent bull with an antler rack like a king's crown. I took a long, steadying breath, settled the rifle butt against my shoulder and squeezed the trigger. The crack of the shot echoed through the valley. The moose staggered, but it didn't fall. Wounded, it crashed into the dense woods. I knew it wouldn't get far. I started following the blood trail, a clear path of dark crimson droplets on the light dusting of snow. For a hunter, this is the line to victory. For me, it became the path into a trap. I tracked it for over an hour. The trail led me into a part of the forest I'd never been in before. The trees were thicker here, the ground rockier. The canopy was so dense that sunlight barely touched the forest floor. A heavy, expectant silence hung in the air. The blood trail led directly to the base of a mountain toward the dark opening of a mine. The old pioneer, I realized. I'd only heard stories about it. They said the mine was bad luck, that a handful of miners had vanished inside it before it was sealed for good. The entrance was boarded up with rotting timbers, but a large hole had been smashed through, big enough for an animal to squeeze through. Fresh blood glistened on the splintered wood. I hesitated for a moment. A cardinal rule of hunting is you never ever follow a wounded, cornered animal into an enclosed space. But my pride, the hunter's ego, got the better of me. This was my kill. I wasn't going to let it go. I'll just flush it out, I muttered to myself, the words sounding hollow in the dead air. I clicked on my headlamp, held my rifle at the ready and squeezed through the narrow opening. The temperature inside the mine dropped instantly. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, decay, and something else. A cloyingly sweet, unpleasant odor I couldn't place. The beam of my headlamp cut a sharp cone of light down a narrow, dripping tunnel. The blood trail was still clear. I moved forward cautiously, the sound of my own boots crunching on the gravel echoing unnaturally in the silence. I called out, a low grunt to try and spook the moose, but there was no response. About 50 yards in, the tunnel opened into a large, cavernous chamber. When the beam of my headlamp swept across the space, the ground seemed to fall away from under me. There was no moose. Instead, in the center of the chamber was a massive pile of human bones. Skulls, ribs, femurs, vertebrae, all tangled together in a grotesque mound. The remains of dozens of people, Deep gouge-like tooth marks were scraped across some of the bones. And the trail of blood, it led directly into the center of the pile and stopped. My mind refused to process what I was seeing. What is this? Whose bones are these? And where was my moose? It was then that I heard a deep grinding rumble behind me. I spun around. The entrance to the mine was gone. In its place was a solid wall of rock and dirt. The entrance had collapsed. I was trapped. An icy wave of pure, primal fear washed over me. I screamed and scrambled back to the rockfall, clawing at the stones with my bare hands, but they were immovable. I fired my rifle at the debris, hoping someone might hear the shots, but the sound was swallowed by the suffocating depths of the mine. Exhausted and terrified, I collapsed. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it would burst. I swung my headlamp's beam back to the bone pile. I finally recognized the sweet, sickening smell. It was the smell of old death. I tried to reason with myself. It was an accident. The mine is old. It just collapsed. A rescue team will come. They'll find me. But a part of me, a deep, instinctual part, knew that wasn't the truth. The blood trail, the bone pile, it was all too perfect. This was a lure. I picked up my rifle and decided to push deeper into the mine. Maybe there was another way out, an air shaft, another exit. I walked for what felt like hours. The tunnels were a labyrinth. Some passages were so narrow I had to crawl. Around every other corner I found smaller piles of bones, animal and human alike. It was like the inhabitant of this place was a messy eater, leaving its scraps everywhere. I lost all sense of time. The battery on my headlamp began to fade, the bright white beam dimming to a sickly yellow. The darkness around me felt more solid, more threatening. Then I heard it. A sound. It wasn't an animal sound, it was a scraping like long, sharp nails being dragged across stone. It was coming from the darkness ahead of me. Scrape, scrape, scrape. I froze, holding my breath. The sound grew closer, then I saw them. At the far edge of my dying light, two green eyes ignited in the blackness. They weren't the eyes of a cat or a wolf. They held an intelligence, an ancient predatory intelligence. The creature slowly moved into the light. It was tall and gaunt, with a vaguely humanoid frame, but its limbs were unnaturally long and thin. Its skin was a pale, hairless yellow stretched so tight over its frame that I could see the outline of its ribs. Its hands, tipped with long black nails that made the scraping sound, nearly touched the floor. Its face, God, its face. It was a distorted mockery of a human's. It had no nose, just two vertical slits. Its mouth was a wide, lipless gash that stretched nearly to its ears. When it opened, it revealed multiple rows of needle-sharp teeth. And dripping from that mouth was the same blood I had been tracking. My mind screamed the realization at me. It wasn't the moose's blood. It was a trap. The creature knew a hunter would follow a blood trail. It had used the moose as bait. It looked at me and let out a low growl, a sound that vibrated deep in my chest. Then it opened its mouth and made a sound that froze the marrow in my bones. It was mimicking my voice, echoing the grunt I had made earlier. I raised my rifle and fired. The bullet hit it square in the chest, but it barely flinched. It just let out a furious shriek and lunged. I turned and ran. I ran for my life, scrambling blindly through the maze of tunnels, the sound of its scraping claws and my own ragged breaths filling my ears. My headlamp flickered one last time and then died. I was in complete, absolute darkness. I fell. Behind me, I could hear its wet, ragged breathing getting closer. I squeezed my eyes shut and waited for the end. When a rescue team, alerted by my long overdue return, finally blasted their way into the collapsed mine weeks later, they found a horrific scene. They found the bone pile, which forensics later confirmed contained remains from different eras, some over a century old. the lost miners and other missing persons from the area. And then they found me. I was near the entrance, unconscious, huddled by the rockfall. I had a compound fracture in my leg and was suffering from severe hypothermia and dehydration. My body was covered in deep parallel scratches, consistent with an animal attack. I was hospitalized for weeks. When I could finally speak, I told them everything: the blood trail, the bone pile, the creature. The doctors said I'd suffered a psychotic break due to trauma, hypoxia, and starvation. The fall, they explained, had caused a head injury, leading my mind to create a monster to explain the horrors. They concluded I'd been mauled by a starving bear or a mountain lion and was lucky to be alive. They didn't want to believe me. Maybe they couldn't. It's been years. I'm physically healed, but the scars on my soul will never fade. I don't hunt anymore. I don't go into the woods alone. Sometimes at night, when I close my eyes, I can still see two green eyes glowing in the dark. I can still hear the sound of nails scraping on stone. People tell me I was lucky to survive. But I know the truth. I didn't survive. The creature let me go. It knew the greatest torment wasn't a quick death, but a long life haunted by memory. It left me alive to tell its story, to live in its shadow. I don't know what it was, an ancient entity, the spirit of the mine, or a secret the wilderness has kept for eons. But I know this: if you're ever in the Alaskan wild and you find a trail of blood, stop and ask yourself one question. Are you sure you're the hunter, or are you the one being hunted? It was September of 2020. I'm Kai. My three friends, Lena, Marcus, and Noah, and I were on a multi-week trek deep in the Alaskan backcountry. We were all experienced hikers and survivalists, the kind of people who felt more at home in the wild than in the city. Our plan was to follow Arctok Creek, a route so remote it was barely on any map. We were looking for an escape from the noise of modern life, a retreat into the profound silence of nature. We had no idea we were about to step into a silence that was worse than any scream. On the 5th day, we descended into a valley that wasn't on our topographical charts. It was narrow and deep, flanked by sheer rock faces that seemed to lean in, blocking out the sky. The air here was unnaturally still, heavy with a strange, melancholic quiet. As we entered, Noah, who was always the most perceptive of our group, stopped. "Something's wrong here," he whispered. "It feels like this place is watching." We laughed it off, but none of us could shake the feeling of unease that had settled over us. About a mile further in, we saw it. Tucked into a grove of skeletal-looking aspens was a small campsite. 2 tents, a fire pit, and gear scattered about. It was clearly old. The tent fabric was tattered and bleached by years of exposure, and rust coated every metal surface. "Looks like some old expedition," Marcus said, cautiously approaching the site. I picked up a weathered leather satchel. Stamped on the flap were the faded words, "University of Alaska Geological Survey, 1998. I remembered reading about that expedition. A team of 4 geologists had come to this region to survey for mineral deposits and had vanished. A massive search had been conducted for months, but not a single trace was ever found. They had simply disappeared. We had just stumbled upon their final resting place. Lena pulled at a tent zipper, which gave way with a rusty groan. The scene inside was surreal. Sleeping bags were unrolled as if waiting for their owners. A book lay open, its pages fluttering in the faint breeze. Tools and maps were laid out neatly. It was as if time had stopped for this camp back in 1998. But then we saw the thing that made our blood run cold. In the center of the camp, on a flat rock used as a table, was their food. Beef jerky, energy bars, dried fruit, and every single item was half-eaten. Someone had taken exactly 1 bite from everything and left the rest. An apple, now withered and black, had a perfect set of teeth marks in it. A can of beans had been opened and exactly half its contents were gone. "What the hell is this?" Noah asked, his voice trembling. "Who leaves food like this, especially out here?" It made no sense. If they'd been attacked by an animal, the camp would have been torn apart, the food devoured. If they'd been caught in a storm, they would have taken their rations with them. This scene defied all logic. It was as if all four of them in the middle of a meal had simultaneously stood up and vanished into thin air. I picked up an energy bar with a bite taken out of it. The teeth marks looked human, but there was a strange uniformity to them, as if the person eating wasn't driven by hunger but by a detached, clinical curiosity. Just a taste. Evening was closing in, and the weather was turning. We made the fateful decision to set up our own camp nearby. It was a terrible mistake. That night, as we sat around our fire, a profound silence fell over the valley. All the ambient sounds of the wilderness, the wind, the insects, the rustle of unseen animals, died. It was the same dead quiet mentioned in a journal we'd found in one of the tents belonging to a Dr. Arlington, one of the geologists. His last few entries were deeply disturbing. October 12th, 1998. Strange. Haven't seen any wildlife for 2 days. The forest is completely silent. The team is on edge. They complain of not feeling hungry despite the hard day's work. October 13th, 1998. We ate dinner tonight, but no one finished their meal. I had no appetite myself. I just took a single bite. It feels as if something else is consuming our hunger for us. The final entry was the one that terrified us the most. October 14th, 1998. It's here. I can feel it. It doesn't want to eat us. It wants to eat our hunger. It's emptying us out. We're getting weaker. Tonight, when we started to eat, we all stopped at the same time. We looked at each other. There was no hunger in our eyes, just a void. And then we saw it. In the darkness. Waiting. It. The journal ended there. Reading it aloud, a chill settled over our group. "What is that supposed to mean?" Marcus scoffed, though his voice betrayed his fear. "How can something eat your hunger?" That night we started to find out. When we broke out our own dinner, none of us were hungry. We had hiked all day. We should have been ravenous. But our stomachs felt numb, hollow but not craving food. We forced ourselves to eat, but every bite felt like chewing on ash. We all stopped eating halfway through our meals. Our anxiety grew. Noah was the most affected, insisting we had to leave. But a storm had rolled in, and the darkness outside was absolute. We had no choice but to wait for morning. Around midnight, a strange sound woke me. It was a wet, lapping noise. Cautiously, I peered out of my tent. In the moonlight, I saw a figure in the old campsite, hunched over the food we had left out. It was a tall, emaciated silhouette, vaguely human in shape, but with limbs that were far too long and thin. It was on all fours, its impossibly long tongue methodically licking the half-eaten food, cleaning the containers. It wasn't eating the food, it was consuming the absence of the food. It was feeding on our abandoned hunger. I held my breath, paralyzed by terror. This was what it did. It had done the same to the 1998 team. It had drained them of their appetite, of their will to eat, leaving them too weak to move. And then, I refused to let my mind finish the thought. I woke the others, gesturing for them to look. We were all frozen in horror. We knew we had to run. Suddenly, Noah, already weakened by fear and the strange lack of appetite, did something none of us expected. He scrambled out of his tent, screaming into the night, "Get away from us! Leave us alone!" The creature, which had been ignoring us, lifted its head. Two large, black, depthless eyes fixed on Noah. A low, guttural growl rumbled from its chest. "Noah, get back here!" Lena screamed. But it was too late. The creature moved with an unnatural, blinding speed. It was a blur of motion, a living shadow. We heard a single choked-off scream from Noah, and then silence. Both the creature and Noah were gone, vanished into the darkness. The three of us were plunged into a state of pure panic. We grabbed what we could and fled into the raging storm, running blindly, not caring where we were going, only knowing we had to get away from that valley. When we finally stumbled back into civilization days later, there were only two of us. Marcus, the strongest of us all, had succumbed to exposure and exhaustion on the trail. Only Lena and I survived. We told the authorities everything: the old camp, the half-eaten food, the creature, Noah's disappearance. They dismissed our story as a shared delusion, a product of trauma, starvation, and the psychological stress of being lost in the wild. Noah and Marcus, they concluded, had likely gotten separated in the storm. A search party was sent. They found nothing. Not the old camp, not Noah's body, not a single shred of evidence that the creature ever existed. It was as if the valley had swallowed all proof. Doctors examined us. They confirmed we were suffering from severe malnutrition, but they couldn't explain its cause. We told them we hadn't felt hungry, but they chalked it up to shock. It's been years. Lena and I don't speak anymore. We're both trying to live with the experience in our own ways. I often wonder what was real. Was there truly a creature, or did our minds, pushed to the brink by isolation and the discovery of a tragic story, conjure a monster from our deepest fears? Did we experience a collective hallucination? But if it was a delusion, where did Noah go? Why was his scream so real, and what happened to that team from 1998? Science and logic offer explanations. They say the wilderness can play tricks on the mind, making you see things that aren't there. But science can't explain the feeling I still have to this day. A feeling of emptiness, as if something essential was scooped out of me in that valley. I don't have the answers. I only know that 4 of us went into that valley and only 2 came back. We went searching for peace and quiet, but we found a hunger that doesn't consume the body but the soul. And that is a hunger that never ever goes away. It was October 2015. My father had acquired the journal of an old prospector which spoke of a remote, abandoned mine nicknamed the Whispering Mine. The prospector wrote that the mine's walls were covered in strange, intricate carvings unlike anything from any known civilization. The symbols feel alive, he wrote. When you look at them, they look back. For my father, that was all it took. He immediately began planning an expedition. I, his son Leo, a history grad student at the time, insisted on going with him. I wanted to assist in his work, but mostly I wanted to be part of the adventure. I had no idea I was about to witness the unraveling of a mystery that would consume my father entirely. We rented a small, isolated cabin in the Chugach Range. The Whispering Mine was a day's hike from there. When we arrived, the autumn colors were breathtaking, a riot of gold and crimson. But despite the beauty, there was a profound desolation in the air. The mine entrance was a dark wound in the side of a cliff. The area around it was unnaturally quiet. We switched on our headlamps and stepped inside. The air was cold and heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth and a sharp metallic tang of ozone. A few hundred feet in, my father saw them. "Leo, look!" His voice was a reverent whisper filled with a mixture of awe and disbelief. I aimed my light where he was pointing. The cavern wall was covered in hundreds of symbols. They were unlike any script I had ever seen. Not Egyptian, not Mayan, not Sumerian. They were a complex fusion of geometric and organic shapes. Some spiraled like galaxies, others branched like trees, and many looked disturbingly like wide-open eyes. "This is impossible," my father breathed. He immediately took out his camera and notebook, beginning the painstaking process of documenting every single mark. For the next several days, that mine became our world. My father worked with a feverish intensity I had never seen before. He would spend hours just staring at the symbols, tracing them with his fingers, trying to decipher their meaning. I assisted him, taking measurements, logging each symbol, and organizing his notes. As the days wore on, I noticed a change in him. He grew more withdrawn, lost in thought. There was a strange, manic gleam in his eyes, as if he were seeing a world beyond the rock face that I couldn't. One evening back at the cabin, he looked up from his notes. "Leo, this isn't a language," he said. "It's a narrative, a sequence. It's a warning." "A warning? About what?" I asked. "I'm not entirely sure yet," he replied, scribbling furiously. "But the symbols, they tell a story about a being trapped in this mine. A being that doesn't feed on flesh or sound, but on consciousness, on knowledge." A chill crawled up my spine. "Dad, this is getting weird. Maybe we should pack up." "No, not yet," he snapped, his voice sharp. "I'm too close. I'm on the verge of the greatest discovery in human history." After that night, the atmosphere in the mine grew heavier. I constantly felt like we were being watched. I started hearing faint whispers that seemed to come from the rock itself, though my father, lost in his work, claimed to hear nothing. One afternoon, while I was measuring a panel of symbols deep inside a narrow tunnel, my headlamp flickered and died, plunging me into absolute darkness. "Dad!" I yelled, my voice tight with panic. No reply. I fumbled in my pocket for my backup flashlight, my hands shaking. In that moment, I felt a cold, damp breath right next to my ear. And then a whisper, not of air but of thought, bloomed inside my own mind. "You are reading too." I screamed and scrambled backward, crashing into my father. My flashlight finally came on and I saw his face was pale, his eyes wide. "You heard it, didn't you?" I asked, my voice trembling. He only nodded. "It's warning us away. It doesn't want us to read the end." After that, I refused to go back into the mine. I begged my father to stop, but he was beyond reason. He said he was almost at the final section, the last symbol, set apart from the others at the very end of the main tunnel. The next day, he went to the mine alone. I waited at the cabin, a knot of dread tightening in my stomach with every passing hour. When he hadn't returned by dusk, I knew something was terribly wrong. I grabbed the most powerful flashlight we had and ran to the mine, shouting his name into the oppressive silence. I found the spot where we had last worked. His gear was there, his pack, his camera, and his open notebook resting on a rock in front of one specific isolated symbol. The final symbol. It was different from all the others. It was an abstract rendering of a human figure trapped inside a circle, surrounded by marks that looked like watching eyes. My father was gone. With trembling hands, I picked up his notebook. On the last page, he had translated the final symbol. His handwriting was a nearly illegible scrawl of haste and terror. The final seal, the glyph of imprisonment. It means, "That which is read shall be contained." It doesn't trap a being. The language itself is the trap. It captures consciousness. When you understand it, you become part of it. Oh God, what have I done? I've read it. I can feel it, pulling me into the stone. The writing ended there. In that instant, the whispers erupted from the walls around me. Dozens, hundreds of voices, all speaking at once in a language I couldn't understand. And among them, I heard my father's voice, clear as day, calling my name. "Leo, run!" I dropped the notebook and ran. I ran for my life as the whispers swirled around me, as shadowy hand-like shapes reached for me from the rock walls. I fell, scrambled up, and kept running until I burst out of the mine's entrance and collapsed into the clean, cold air of the evening. I told the authorities everything. A search and rescue team went into the mine. They found my father's equipment and his notebook, but they found no trace of him. He had vanished as if he had never been there at all. The official report concluded that Dr. Elias Vance likely fell into an unstable fissure, and his body was lost under a rockfall. The writings in his journal were dismissed as the product of extreme psychological distress brought on by isolation and obsession. The case was closed, but I know the truth. It's been years. I've never touched my father's research. His notebook sits in an evidence locker somewhere. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I had read that final symbol myself. Would I be trapped in those walls with him? I believe my father isn't dead. He's imprisoned in that mine, a part of the stone, another voice in the chorus of countless souls captured by that ancient predatory knowledge. The language was a cage, and it fed on the very mind that deciphered it. People say that knowledge is power, but some knowledge is a prison. Some doors are not meant to be opened. My father opened one, and he paid for it with his soul. My brother Daniel was always a restless soul. He was one of those people who found peace not in the glow of city lights, but in the deep, profound silence of the mountains. He was a geologist by trade, but his real passion was exploring old, forgotten mines. He used to say that every abandoned tunnel held a century's worth of stories. It was this obsession that led him to Alaska's Kenai Peninsula to study a defunct network of silver mines known as Silver Creek. He promised he'd be back in a week. When 10 days passed with no word, a cold dread began to settle in our family. Daniel was an experienced outdoorsman. He wasn't reckless. We notified the authorities, but I, his older sister Maya, couldn't just sit at home and wait. I booked the next flight to Anchorage. The only thing I had from him was a single voicemail, left 2 days before he went silent. At the time, it had just seemed strange. Now it was a terrifying enigma I had listened to 100 times. His voice on the message was strained, laced with static and the sound of a howling wind. Maya, there's something out here. I've seen it. It's watching me. It's trying to copy me. Oh God, Maya, it's taking my shape. The message cut off with a sound like a high-pitched, inhuman shriek. Those words played on a loop in my head. It's taking my shape. What could that possibly mean? The local sheriff told me they'd found Daniel's truck parked at an old trailhead leading to the mines. A small search party had gone in but found nothing. The weather was turning, and they'd temporarily suspended the search. I hired a local guide, a grizzled older man named Jacob, whose quiet confidence was more reassuring than any empty platitudes. I played him the voicemail. He listened intently, his face unreadable, but a deep, ancient worry flickered in his eyes. There are old stories about this area, he said, his voice low and gravelly. The native elders call it the Valley of Echoes. They say something lives there that feeds on loneliness, and then replaces it. His words amplified my fear, but they didn't deter me. I had to find my brother. The next morning, we set out for the mine. The entire hike was shrouded in an unnerving quiet. The forest was so still I could hear the frantic thumping of my own heart. When we reached the mine entrance, it looked like a black gaping mouth set into the mountainside. "I'll wait out here," Jacob said, his hand resting on the rifle slung over his shoulder. "I have a healthy respect for places like this. Yell if you need me." I took a deep breath, switched on my headlamp, and stepped into the darkness. The air inside was frigid and dead still. The beam from my lamp cut a sharp, lonely path into the gloom. "Daniel!" I called out. My voice echoed back, distorted and strange. Il. I pushed forward, my heart pounding with a mix of hope and terror. I scanned every corner, searching for any sign of him. After about 30 minutes of walking, the narrow tunnel opened into a large, cathedral-like chamber. And there, In the middle of the chamber was a figure. It was Daniel. He had his back to me, examining some markings on the far wall. He was wearing the same red flannel jacket he'd had on when he left home. "Daniel!" I cried out, a wave of relief so powerful it almost brought me to my knees. I started running toward him. He turned around slowly. "Maya, what are you doing here?" A wide smile spread across his face, but it wasn't Daniel's smile. It was too broad, too perfect. His eyes, there was no light in them. They were like two flat, polished stones. "I came to get you," I said, the relief in my voice already being replaced by a creeping dread. "We were all so worried." "Worried? Why?" he asked, the smile never wavering. "I'm fine, just doing my work." His tone was flat, devoid of emotion, of warmth. It was my brother's voice, but it wasn't his soul. Your voicemail," I stammered. "You said something was taking your shape." He laughed. It was a hollow, empty sound. "Oh, that? I was just messing with you. The signal is terrible out here, you know?" I took a step back. This was wrong. My brother would never make a joke like that, not in that tone. "Come on, let's go home," he said, taking a step toward me. There was a subtle stiffness to his movements, like a marionette being controlled by an unskilled puppeteer. "No," I whispered. "First you tell me what happened to you." For a split second, the smile vanished. His face became a complete blank. "I told you nothing happened." "Are you doubting me, Maya?" "Your own sister?" he said. "Your own sister, not your own brother." The cold dread inside me turned to ice. It was a small slip, a tiny mistake, but it confirmed everything. Whatever this thing was, it was still learning. "You're not Daniel," I said, my voice shaking. The wide, unnatural smile returned to its face. "Of course I am. And now you'll stay with us. We'll be a happy family." It lunged. I screamed and scrambled back, turning and running for the entrance. Behind me, I heard its voice. No longer just Daniel's, but a horrifying chorus of dozens of different voices. Men, women, children, all screaming as one. I burst out of the mine and ran straight into Jacob, who already had his rifle raised. "Go, now!" I shrieked. We didn't look back. We went straight to the sheriff's office. I told them everything, my voice cracking with hysteria. Jacob corroborated my story, telling the sheriff about the old legends. The sheriff, a pragmatic man, clearly thought I was in shock. But at Jacob's insistence, and with the undeniable fact that a man was still missing, he agreed to organize a larger armed party to go back to the mine. When they reached the chamber, it was empty. There was no one there, no sign of Daniel. But this time, they did find something. In a dark corner of the chamber, they found a pile of clothes, the same red flannel jacket and jeans Daniel had been wearing. And underneath them, it wasn't human remains. It was a strange, grayish, gelatinous substance, like a pile of melted skin. It looked like something had shed its old form. Officially, Daniel is still a missing person. The case was eventually closed, filed away as unresolved. The gray substance was sent to a lab, but its composition matched no known biological organism. I went back home. I tried to piece my life back together, but I was never the same. I still check my phone every day, half hoping, half dreading a message from Daniel. Sometimes late at night, I get a call from a blocked number. I never answer. But one night I picked it up by accident. There was only silence on the other end. And then, through the static, I heard a faint, distorted whisper, a perfect imitation of my brother's voice. "Maya, why did you leave? I'm waiting for you." I don't know what was in that mine. A doppelganger, a shapeshifter, some ancient thing that lures people in by mimicking their loved ones. I only know that my brother died in that mine, and whatever came out in his place is still out there, wandering the wilderness, looking exactly like him and maybe looking for someone new to echo. My name is Aaron, and I make documentaries. My specialty is digging up the stories the world has forgotten. But there's one story I'll never be able to forget, no matter how hard I try. It's the story of the last echo mine and the field of unmarked graves that guards it. It was October 2021. Our team of 4, myself, my cinematographer Sarah, our sound engineer Ben, and a local historian, Dr. Evelyn Reed, arrived in a remote sector of the Alaskan interior. Our mission was to investigate the mystery of several dozen unmarked graves scattered outside a century-old abandoned mine. There was no record of them in any historical archives. It was as if the people buried there had been erased from memory. When we arrived, the scene was even more unsettling than we'd imagined. The mine entrance was a black void, and before it, under a light blanket of early snow, lay about 50 small, crude graves. No headstones, no crosses, no names, just simple mounds of rock. "This is all wrong," Dr. Reed said, her voice a mix of academic curiosity and genuine unease. Deaths were common in mining camps, but they were almost always marked. This feels deliberate, like an attempt to dishonor them, or worse, to hide them. A heavy silence hung in the air. Even the birds were quiet. We set up our base camp a safe distance from the mine. The plan was to spend the next few days surveying the site, taking soil samples, and if we got the permit, excavating a single grave to determine who was buried here and how they died. The first night was unnervingly peaceful. It was the calm before the storm. On the second day, the permit came through. We were cleared to excavate one grave for archaeological purposes. We chose a mound that was slightly isolated from the others. Ben set up his sensitive audio equipment to capture any ambient sounds during the dig, while Sarah filmed every moment. We began to dig. The ground was hard and rocky. After hours of grueling work, our shovels hit wood. "We've got a coffin," I said, a surge of adrenaline cutting through my fatigue. We carefully brushed away the remaining dirt. It was a simple pine box, decaying after a century underground. We all exchanged glances, our hearts pounding. We were about to uncover a secret locked away for 100 years. Ben and I gripped the rotted lid and lifted. It was empty. No bones, no scraps of clothing, no remains whatsoever. Just damp earth and writhing worms. We stood in stunned silence. "How is that possible?" Sarah whispered. "Why would anyone bury an empty coffin?" Dr. Reed's face had gone pale. "This isn't a grave," she said, her voice trembling. "It's a marker, or a trap." Before we could process her words, the sun began to set, painting the sky in bruised shades of orange and purple. We hastily filled the grave back in and retreated to our camp. None of us slept well that night. The image of the empty coffin was burned into our minds. Around midnight, it began. At first, it was just a faint whisper on the edge of hearing, like the wind, but then it grew clearer. "Aaron." The voice was right outside my tent. It was a woman's voice, filled with a desperate, pleading sorrow. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. I grabbed my walkie-talkie. "Ben, did you hear that?" "Yeah," his strained voice crackled back. "It's calling my name." Soon we all heard them. Not one voice, but dozens, men, women, even children, circling our camp, whispering our names. "Sarah, we're so cold." "Ben, help us." "Evelyn, you woke us up." The voices weren't coming from any single direction. They weren't in our ears. They were inside our heads. It was an unbearable psychic assault. Ben, who was already on edge, unzipped his tent. "I'm going to see who's out there." "No, Ben, don't," I yelled, but he was already gone. We saw the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness, darting around the camp. Then the light swung toward the graveyard. "There's no one here," he shouted, his voice thin against the vast silence. "It's just in our heads." At that exact moment, his flashlight winked out, and a single blood-curdling scream tore through the night. And then, nothing. The three of us huddled in our tents, paralyzed with fear. The voices had stopped. We called for Ben again and again, but only the dead silence answered. At first light, we forced ourselves to go outside. Ben's tent was open. His flashlight lay on the ground near the edge of the graveyard. But Ben was gone. We followed his footprints in the snow. They led in a straight line to the grave we had excavated. And there, on the freshly disturbed earth, the tracks simply ended. It was as if the ground had swallowed him whole. We used our satellite phone to call for an emergency evacuation. Hours later, a helicopter arrived to lift us out of that cursed place. We told the sheriff everything. The empty grave, the voices in the night, Ben's disappearance. He looked at us with a mixture of pity and suspicion, attributing our story to collective hysteria and trauma. Ben, he suggested, must have panicked and run off into the wilderness. A massive search and rescue operation was launched. They combed the area for days but found no trace of Ben. They re-excavated the grave. This time, when they opened the coffin, it wasn't empty. Ben's body was inside. He was lying peacefully, his body cold and stiff, with a serene smile on his face. The coroner's report listed the cause of death as undetermined. There were no signs of trauma, no toxins, no illness. It was as if he had simply stopped living. Officially, the case was closed as a tragic accident. The prevailing theory was that Ben, disoriented in the dark, had fallen into the open grave and died of exposure. But we know the truth. The three of us, me, Sarah, and Dr. Reed, were never the same. We never finished the documentary. Some stories are not meant to be told. I don't know what those graves were. Were they truly empty, only to be filled when someone answered their call? Were they prisons for spirits that needed a new host? Or was it some ancient power in the land itself punishing those who trespassed? I only know that we disturbed something that should have been left alone. We went looking for answers, but we came back with a question that will haunt us for the rest of our lives. What if that night it had been me who stepped out of the tent instead of Ben? It's human nature, I think, to want to own a piece of history. An old coin, a shard of pottery, a rusted tool. We see them as souvenirs. But I learned that some souvenirs carry memories that are best left buried. It was September 2019. I'm Ryan. My three college friends, Alex, Jessica, and Mike, and I, were on a week-long trekking and camping trip in the Alaskan wilderness. We were young, arrogant, and felt like we could conquer the world. Our plan was to hike along Frostbite Creek, an area known for its stark beauty and the century-old abandoned ironwood mine. On the third day of our trip, we found it. The mine was a dark scar on the mountainside, its timber frame rotting and collapsing under the weight of time. It was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. "Let's check it out," Mike said, always the most impulsive of our group. We switched on our flashlights and hesitantly stepped inside. The air was cold and damp, and the sound of our footsteps echoed in the profound silence. Deeper inside, we found the remnants of the miners' lives. Broken lanterns, a dilapidated ore cart, and against one wall a set of old tools. A rusted pickaxe, a heavy sledgehammer, and a long, pointed chisel. "Wow, these have to be over 100 years old," Jessica said in awe. "I'm taking the pickaxe," Mike announced, pulling it from the wall. "This will look so cool in my apartment." "Mike, I don't think that's a good idea," Alex said. He was always the cautious one. "We should leave things as they are." "Relax," Mike laughed. "Who's gonna know?" Spurred on by his bravado, I grabbed the heavy sledgehammer and Jessica took the chisel. We figured they would be the ultimate souvenirs from our adventure. Alex didn't take anything. He just watched us with a strange, worried look in his eyes. We brought the tools back to our campsite about a half-mile from the mine. We propped them up against a large rock outside our tents and sat around the campfire. That night, as we watched the stars blaze in the ink-black sky, Alex spoke up. "I've got a bad feeling about this place," he said quietly. "It feels like we broke a rule." We laughed it off. The next morning, I crawled out of my tent and saw that the rock was bare. The pickaxe, the sledgehammer, and the chisel were gone. "Mike, cut it out!" I yelled, assuming he was playing a prank. "I didn't do anything," he said, emerging from his tent, a look of genuine confusion on his face. We searched the entire campsite. The tools were nowhere. "Maybe an animal dragged them off?" Jessica suggested, but we all knew that was ridiculous. Why would any animal take 3 heavy metal tools? Alex looked at us, his eyes wide with a dawning horror. "They went back." "What do you mean, went back?" I asked. "Back where they belong," he said, gesturing toward the mine. We didn't want to believe him, but we had no other explanation. The 4 of us started walking back to the mine, a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. When we got back to the same spot deep inside the tunnel, the ground seemed to drop out from under me. The 3 tools, the pickaxe, the sledgehammer, and the chisel, were leaning against the wall in the exact same positions we had found them in. This is impossible," Jessica stammered. But that wasn't the most terrifying part. The tools, which had been covered in a century of rust, were now smeared with something dark and wet. Fresh blood. There were crimson streaks on the head of the pickaxe, the face of the sledgehammer, and the tip of the chisel. Some of it was still dripping onto the dusty floor. "Whose blood is that?" Mike asked, his voice choked with terror. We all looked at each other. The 4 of us were here. Who else could it be? Suddenly, Alex clutched the side of his neck. Blood was seeping through his fingers. There, on his skin, was a deep, clean gash as if made by a sharp blade. "Alex, what happened to you?" I yelled, rushing to his side. I don't know," he said, his voice weak. "I didn't feel anything last night." The horrifying realization hit us all at once. The blood was Alex's. The tools had moved on their own in the dead of night, wounded him as he slept, and then returned to their resting place. The thought was so insane, so utterly impossible that my mind struggled to accept it. We helped Alex back to the camp as fast as we could. We knew we had to get out of there. We frantically started packing our gear. Alex's wound was deep and he was starting to look pale. Just as we were ready to leave, Mike cried out, My pack is gone." We looked. His backpack, which held our satellite phone, the map, and our emergency food supply, had vanished. "You must have misplaced it," I said, but that same cold dread was crawling up my spine. Alex, his voice trembling, whispered, "It took it. The same thing that moved the tools. It doesn't want us to leave." Our situation was now critical. We had a wounded man, and our only way to navigate or call for help was gone. Panic began to set in. We decided our only option was to follow the creek downstream, hoping it would eventually lead to a road or a ranger station. But we were exhausted, terrified, and Alex was slowing us down. On the second day, Mike, consumed by guilt, announced he was going to go for help alone. He argued he could move faster by himself. We tried to stop him, but he was resolute. He disappeared into the dense woods. We never saw him again. Jessica and I struggled on, practically carrying Alex between us, but 2 days later, he died. The wound had become infected and we had no way to treat it. We buried him by the creek, marking the spot with a pile of stones. Now it was just the 2 of us. We were starving, exhausted, and on the verge of giving up. By some miracle, a hunter found us a day later. We were barely conscious. He saved our lives and got us to the nearest town. We told the authorities the whole story: the mine, the tools, the blood, our missing friends. They looked at us with pity, attributing our account to trauma and malnutrition. Alex, they theorized, was likely injured by an animal, and Mike had simply gotten lost after panicking. A search party was dispatched. They found the tools in the mine exactly where we said they'd be, but they were clean. No blood, just rust. They found Mike's backpack in a deep, inaccessible crevice of the mine, but they never found a trace of Mike himself. He remains on a list of the missing. I don't know what really happened out there. Did those tools actually move? Was there some force in that mine jealously guarding its property? Or was it all a series of tragic coincidences amplified by our own terrified minds? Logic says it's impossible. But I know what I saw. I saw the fresh blood on those tools. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we had just left those souvenirs alone. Would all four of us still be alive today? It's a question I'll never have an answer to, and it's a weight I'll have to carry for the rest of my life. It was October 2022. I'm Dr. Alan Carter, a geologist who back then believed the world was composed of nothing more than rock, pressure, and time. I was leading a small 4-person team deep into the Alaskan backcountry, a region so remote it felt like stepping onto a prehistoric version of Earth. With me were my bright young protege, Liam, a kid whose enthusiasm was as vast as the landscapes we studied. Our team botanist, Clara, a sharp, pragmatic scientist who saw stories in soil and pollen. And our guide and security expert, a man named Mason. Mason was a quiet, imposing figure of Athabascan descent, a man who understood the wilderness not just as a place, but as a living entity. Our mission was to study the unique geological and biological environment around the sleeping giant mine, a century-old copper mine that was abandoned abruptly in the early 1920s. The official records were sparse, citing unworkable conditions and geological instability. But the local lore, the stories Mason had grown up with, were far more colorful and far more sinister. When we finally arrived after a grueling 3-day trek, the site was far stranger than we'd anticipated. The mine entrance wasn't a narrow shaft, but a wide, cavernous opening like a gaping mouth in the mountainside. The air that drifted out was cold and smelled of damp earth and something else. Something vaguely metallic and organic, like old blood. The ground inside was not rock or gravel, but a thick, unbroken floor of slick, dark clay. It was strangely damp, despite the dry, crisp autumn weather outside. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was the imprints. Pressed into the clay floor, stretching deep into the darkness of the mine, were dozens, perhaps hundreds, of perfect life-sized impressions of human bodies. Each one was startlingly clear. You could see the distinct curve of a head, the broadness of shoulders, the slender length of arms and legs. There were shapes of large men, slighter women, and chillingly the small, fragile forms of children. They were arranged in no discernible pattern, some lying straight, others curled as if in sleep. It was as if a whole community had lain down in the mud and then simply been lifted away or had dissolved into nothing. "My God," Liam whispered, his usual boisterous energy completely gone, replaced by a hushed awe. "What is this?" "Some kind of ancient ritual, maybe," Clara theorized, already kneeling to examine the edge of one imprint, her scientific curiosity overriding her initial shock. "A form of earth worship, a mass burial where the bodies were later removed." Mason, who had stood silently at the entrance, finally spoke. He shook his head slowly, his expression one of deep, solemn respect and a fear that seemed ancient. "No," he said, his voice low and gravelly, barely more than a murmur. "This is not a place of worship. My elders say this ground is hungry. It is a patient hunter. It pulls sleepers down into itself. This isn't a graveyard. It's a dinner table. A profound chill, colder than the Alaskan air, went through us at his words. As scientists, our minds immediately tried to rationalize it. A metaphor, a local legend to explain a tragedy. We dismissed it as folklore and set about our work. We had a job to do. We made camp a few hundred yards from the mine, close enough for access, but far enough, we hoped, to be out of whatever oppressive atmosphere clung to the place. For the rest of the day, we were consumed by our work. We took soil samples from the clay, measured the precise dimensions of the imprints, and photographed them from every conceivable angle. The clay was unusual. It had a strange elasticity and was cool to the touch, almost unnaturally so. As the sun began to set, casting long, distorted shadows that made the imprints look like they were writhing, we retreated to our camp. The mood was subdued. Mason's words, despite our scientific skepticism, had planted a seed of unease. We ate our dinner in near silence, the crackle of the campfire the only sound in the vast, empty wilderness. That night, I had the most terrifying experience of my life. I was in a deep, dreamless sleep when I became aware of an immense pressure on top of me. It wasn't a dream. It was a physical, crushing weight, pushing me down, through my sleeping bag, into the very earth beneath me. I tried to open my eyes, but my lids felt glued shut. I tried to scream, but my throat was paralyzed. No sound would leave my lungs. It felt as if a giant, invisible hand was pressing down on my entire body. My body was sinking. I could feel the ground beneath my tent floor softening, yielding, becoming a cold, thick mire that was enveloping me. Panic, pure and primal, flooded my system. In a surge of adrenaline-fueled terror, I fought back. I thrashed with all my might, bucking my arms and legs against the unseen force. It was like trying to swim up from the bottom of a deep, muddy lake. Suddenly, as quickly as it had begun, the pressure was gone. I shot upright, gasping for air, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. My body was drenched in cold sweat. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hand shaking so badly I could barely grip it. I aimed the beam at my sleeping bag. It was stained with patches of damp earth that had seeped up through the tent floor. I scrambled out of the bag and looked at the ground where I had been lying. It was slightly depressed in the perfect shape of my own body. Shaking uncontrollably, I stumbled out of my tent. The night was silent and still. Then another tent flap unzipped. It was Clara, her face pale as a ghost in the moonlight. A moment later, Liam emerged from his tent looking just as terrified. You felt it too?" Clara asked, her voice a trembling whisper that barely carried in the cold air. We all had. We had all been pinned down, pushed into the earth by some impossible, suffocating force. Only Mason hadn't emerged from his tent. "Mason!" I called out, my voice cracking. Silence. "Mason, are you okay?" Still nothing. A new, more profound dread washed over me. I walked over to his tent and unzipped the flap. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness inside. His sleeping bag lay on the floor, but it was empty. And beneath it, pressed deep into the tent floor, was a perfect, fresh imprint of Mason's large body, far deeper and clearer than the one I had left in my own tent. He was gone. A wave of absolute horror, cold and sharp, washed over us. Mason's words, the words we had dismissed as superstition, echoed in my mind. "This ground is hungry." We knew we had to get out of there, now. There was no discussion, no debate. We grabbed only our most essential gear, a day pack with some food, water purifiers, our satellite phone, and started running blindly into the darkness. We didn't dare look back. We ran for hours, fueled by terror. When the sun finally rose, a pale, indifferent light in the gray sky, we realized we were hopelessly lost. In our panic, we had run in the wrong direction. We were deeper in the wilderness, not closer to the trail. We had no guide, and Mason had been carrying the primary map. We were alone in the unforgiving Alaskan wild. The next few days were a blur of misery and fear. We battled starvation, dehydration, and a constant gnawing paranoia. Every time we stopped to rest, we couldn't shake the feeling that the ground beneath us was watching, waiting. We took turns sleeping, never lying down for more than a few minutes at a time. Liam, the youngest and least experienced of us, began to weaken. The terror had taken a greater toll on him. On the third day, he collapsed while we were crossing a shallow, icy river. He just fell and didn't get up again. We tried to carry him, but we barely had the strength to carry ourselves. We had to leave him there, a decision that will haunt me for the rest of my life. Now it was just me and Clara. We were no longer scientists. We were just two animals trying to survive. We pushed on, driven by the most basic instinct. Hope was a dwindling resource, a flickering candle in a storm. On what we think was the sixth day, when we were on the verge of collapse, hallucinating from hunger and exhaustion, a miracle happened. A park ranger on a long-range patrol found us. We were airlifted to a hospital. We told them everything: the mine, the imprints in the clay, the crushing pressure, the disappearance of our colleagues. They listened patiently, but we could see the look in their eyes. They treated our story as a shared delusion, a folie à deux brought on by extreme trauma, malnutrition, and hypothermia. A major search operation was launched, more for procedure's sake than anything else. They found the mine. They found the imprints. The analysis of the clay was baffling to the geologists who studied it. It contained a previously unknown extremophilic microorganism that, when deprived of light and subjected to pressure, could temporarily alter the soil's viscosity, liquefying it into a dense, quicksand-like slurry. They found Mason's tent and the deep imprint beneath his sleeping bag. But they never found a trace of Mason himself. They found Liam's body in the river, and the coroner ruled his death was due to hypothermia and exposure. Officially, the case was closed with a logical, if tragic, explanation. Mason, a man steeped in local superstitions, likely had a panic attack, fled into the wilderness, and succumbed to the elements. Liam died of exposure. The pressure we felt was officially explained away as a combination of minor seismic tremors, common in the region, and our own terrified, oxygen-starved imaginations. But Clara and I know the truth. The official report could explain the how, but it couldn't explain the why. It couldn't explain the malevolent intent we felt. I don't do field work anymore. I stay in my lab, surrounded by concrete and steel. Clara left geology altogether. We don't talk much anymore. The shared memory is too heavy a burden. As a scientist, I'm supposed to believe in the rational, the provable, but I can't dismiss the feeling of that pressure. It was not a natural force. It was deliberate. It was hungry. I don't know what it was, the microorganisms acting as a collective predator, the land itself, or something far older. But I know it was real. Every night when I lie down in bed, even in the safety of my own home, I am acutely aware of the ground beneath me, miles of earth and rock, and I pray that it isn't hungry. It was October 2018. My name is Sam, an amateur historian. I was on a week-long expedition with 3 of my closest friends. My brother Leo, a gifted photographer, his fiancée Anna, a nurse with a steady hand and a kind heart, and our friend Mark, a seasoned hiker who was our anchor in the wild. Our goal was to locate and document the Father's Prospect, a long-forgotten mine near a place called Whispering Creek. The mine was run by a single family in the 1930s, a family that, according to the sparse records, had vanished without a trace. On the 4th day of our trek, we found it. The mine was a small, narrow opening, almost completely swallowed by overgrown brush. A strange, sorrowful quiet hung over the place. As we got closer, Anna pointed to something at the mouth of the mine. Tucked inside a small, deliberate circle of stones lay a collection of items. They weren't toys, they were idols. Small humanoid figures molded from a slick black clay. Standing about 6 inches tall, they appeared handmade, but their forms were grotesque and deeply unsettling. Their bodies were unnaturally elongated, their heads too large, and their faces were featureless except for gaping hollow pits where eyes should be and mouths stretched open in silent screams. Moss clung to them like ancient skin, but their horrifying shapes were unmistakable. These were not a child's playthings. They were the malevolent artifacts of some forgotten, nightmarish cult. "What are they?" Leo whispered, already raising his camera, the photographer in him captivated by their sheer strangeness. "They feel ancient," I said, crouching down but hesitating to touch one. It felt heavier and colder than stone, radiating a palpable chill. Strange, spidery symbols were carved into its surface. "Sam, don't touch them," Mark warned, his voice low and serious. "This place feels wrong." But the thrill of discovery, the arrogance of adventure had us in its grip. Anna, an avid collector of historical artifacts, reached out and picked up an idol whose head was cocked at an unnatural angle. Leo chose another, one with its spindly arms raised to the sky as if in supplication. They spoke excitedly about this being the find of a lifetime. We set up our camp a few hundred yards away. That evening, as we sat around the fire, Anna and Leo were examining the idols, trying to cross-reference the symbols on their phones with no success. "These markings don't match any known language, ancient or modern," Anna murmured, fascinated. "I feel weird," Mark said suddenly, his gaze fixed on the dark, impenetrable tree line. "Like we're being watched." We all looked into the oppressive darkness, but there was nothing. Just the silent trees and the vast, empty sky. That night, it began. I was asleep in my tent when a faint sound woke me. It was the sound of children laughing. It was distant and light, like something carried on the wind. I told myself I was dreaming, but then I heard it again. Closer this time. Not one child, but several, their voices mingling. But this laughter wasn't innocent. It had a guttural, raspy quality, as if something ancient and dry was trying to mimic the sound of a child. I slowly unzipped my tent and peered out. The campsite was still and empty in the moonlight. The laughter was coming from the direction of the mine. It was a sound that was simultaneously childlike and profoundly demonic. The next morning at breakfast, I hesitated before asking, "Did anyone hear anything last night?" Anna and Leo shook their heads, but Mark looked up at me, his eyes grim. "That laughter?" he asked quietly. I nodded. We had both heard it. "Probably just the wind," Leo said, though he didn't sound convinced. That day, we decided to explore the mine. We switched on our headlamps and stepped into the cool, damp darkness. The mine wasn't deep. After a few hundred feet, it ended in a small, rough-hewn chamber. On the far wall, someone had scrawled a message in charcoal. "They want them back." "What the hell?" Anna said, her voice trembling. Before any of us could answer, all 4 of our headlamps flickered and died at the exact same moment. We were plunged into absolute suffocating blackness. "Don't panic," Mark's voice cut through the dark. We fumbled for each other's hands and started shuffling toward the entrance. And that's when we heard it again, the laughter. This time it was right behind us, inside the chamber. It was so close we could almost feel the cold vibration of it on our necks. It was a sound that did not belong to anything living. We screamed and ran, stumbling and crashing into each other. When we burst out of the mine entrance, blinking in the daylight, we were all gasping for air. We checked on each other. We were all safe. But then Leo looked at Anna and the color drained from his face. "Anna, your hair." She reached up and touched a strand of her long brown hair. A thick lock right at the front had turned bone white from root to tip. That was it. We were done. We decided to pack up immediately and leave first thing in the morning. That night, the sounds were louder, more insistent. It wasn't just laughter anymore, it was whispers. And they were calling Anna and Leo by name. Anna, come play with us. Leo, your idol is waiting. Anna and Leo were huddled in their tent, terrified. Mark and I sat by the fire, staying awake, armed with a hatchet and a knife. Around midnight, the sounds abruptly stopped. A long, heavy silence fell. Maybe they're gone, I whispered, daring to hope. At that exact moment, the zipper on Leo and Anna's tent slid slowly open. They both stepped out. Their eyes were wide open but completely blank, like glass. They looked like they were in a trance. They didn't look at us. They just started walking in perfect unison toward the mine. "Leo, Anna, stop!" Mark yelled, jumping up and running after them. I was right behind him. We grabbed their arms, trying to hold them back, but they had an unnatural, immovable strength. They shrugged us off as if we were children. They kept walking, their pace steady and unhurried, straight for the black maw of the mine. When they reached the entrance, they stopped for a single, heart-stopping moment. They turned and looked back at us. Their faces were utterly devoid of expression. And then they both smiled. A smile that wasn't theirs. It was too wide, too empty, too horrifying. Then they stepped into the darkness and were gone. Mark and I stood there, frozen in terror and disbelief. We couldn't bring ourselves to go in after them. We waited until morning, calling their names until our voices were raw, but only the silence answered. We knew we had to get help. We abandoned our camp and ran. After 2 days of a nightmarish non-stop trek, we stumbled onto a logging road and were found. We told the authorities the entire story. The clay idols, the horrifying laughter, the way our friends had just walked away. They treated our account as the ravings of traumatized, exhausted minds. The official theory was that Leo and Anna, suffering from a shared psychotic break, had wandered off into the wilderness and gotten lost. A massive search and rescue operation was launched. They scoured the area for a week. They never found Leo or Anna. But they did find something else. Inside the mine, in the back chamber where our lights had failed, they found 2 new objects lying on the floor. A small, freshly molded black clay idol of a woman, with a single stark white streak painted in her hair. And another idol of a man holding a small box-like object that looked disturbingly like a camera. And next to them, the original idols that Anna and Leo had taken were back in their place. Officially, Leo and Anna are still listed as missing. Their case is cold, filed away under unresolved. I don't know what was in that mine. Were they the artifacts of some ancient evil entity that calls its lost pieces home? Was that laughter the sound of the idols themselves, luring new victims to join their silent, screaming collection? I only know that we trespassed, and we took something that didn't belong to us. And in return, it turned our friends into idols. Sometimes late at night, I can still hear that laughter in the back of my mind. It echoes in my quietest moments. And I know that they are still in that mine, now part of the collection, waiting as little clay figures for someone else to come and play.